the phenomenal Andrew Pearce, whom I'm sure many of you know. Certainly, we know Andrew very, very well at Dial because we're honoured that he is on our advisory board. But in addition to that, he is the Managing Director at Accenture, who has a number of different hats on top of that, including the UK Chair for the ELC. He's a non-executive director for Kingston University. He's an advisory board member with various other organisations, and he does a huge amount of public speaking, predominantly around standing together against racism and Black Lives Matter. He's recently been featured on CNN, and for many years in a row, again, has been listed as one of the top influencers when it comes to race and ethnicity on the Empower list. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and I hope everybody's well on this kind of warm afternoon. And certainly, at the end of coming to the end of another busy week, it's good to spend some time to talk about these topics. So, thank you for inviting me.
Well, thanks very much for being here, Andrew, because I know that you are, you're a man in demand at the moment, especially with a huge amount of media attention that is surrounding everything to do with not only Black Lives Matter, but also, race and ethnicity in general around the globe. So it's really brilliant that we have you here today, not only to perhaps, kickstart things with a little bit about your personal story, which I'm lucky to know, obviously, is very fascinating, and how you came to be where you are today, but also then to take us into a deep dive into really what organisations can do when it comes to promoting race, ethnicity, and also really driving forward not only words, but most importantly, action, which I know is what you're going to be talking about to us all today.
Yeah, and yes, thank you for that. And so, if you will indulge me, I will spend a few minutes just talking about my life story and to give some indication about why this topic is so important to me and to my background. And then, yes, I do want to talk about Black Lives Matter and also how to be anti-racist. So I'm going to share my screen because I've got a few slides to share. So let me just give you a little bit of background about me. I've actually put some numbers on some pictures here. I'm not going to talk in detail about each of these pictures, but just to give you some background. But a very important one is that picture one, and you may recognise a very little Andrew there with his toy, and mum and dad. You'll notice that they are both white. I was adopted at 10 days old. I was born in the Lake District, and that's where I was brought up, and from the Northwest. And I was born in the 60s, a time when you still saw signs, saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. It was a time where National Front and skinheads, certainly when I was a teenager, were quite prevalent. And I was, in essence, the only black child at my primary school, at grammar school, and in the area. And why I mention this is that I lived through a time of what you could call very overt, aggressive racism. And my parents, they adopted a black child in the 60s. And in the environment that was all white. And, my mother is still, and my father is still very much my hero, because they put up with a huge amount of abuse. But one thing that was always made very clear to me from being very early is that people are people. Everybody has a story, and you do not judge people based on whether it's their sexuality, whether it's their gender, whether it's their skin color, whether it's their disability, whether it's their religion. People are people. And, you will have to work, and that was very much the motto my mother gave me, you'll have to work twice as hard as everybody else because this is the reality of the world that you live in. But they inculcated in me that very important thing about everybody being inclusive and how to be inclusive. And you'll notice that I've moved on a little bit now, but I hope you get the tenet that I grew up in what were challenging circumstances for a child. I spent a lot of my childhood playing on my own, which was not necessarily a bad thing because I learned to be comfortable with myself. I spent a lot of time reading. of course did have friends, but quite often I'd be the one sitting at the side of the playground, you know, if you like, swinging my shoes, watching everybody else play. Moving on there, you see number 2. That's my matriculation, actually. That was at Keble College, Oxford. Following school, I went off to university. I was sponsored by the Air Force. I'd always intended to finish my physics degree and then do a DPhil in medical physics. But I finished up seeing an advert for wanted maths and physics undergraduates come and join the Air Force. And before I knew it, you know, I was in the Air Force and they were sponsoring me through university. And that was a very, again, a defining experience, because once more, there were very few faces that looked like me at university. And certainly in the Air Force, very few people, again, who were black and going through officer training. And you'll see through there, that was after my officer training. I won one of the trophies. So that will be now 35 years ago in November. That was my graduation. So November 7th, 35 years ago is when I graduated. And I spent 16 years in the Air Force. I retired from the Air Force after 16 years as a squadron leader before moving into the commercial world. And on 4 there, you can see me on the flight deck of, I think it's a TriStar there, on its way down to Ascension. So I had that period of that military period, which was very good. Again, were the challenges because of the colour of my skin? Yes, most definitely. And it was always important to me, therefore, to ensure that I did speak out and approach the topics around it, because, you know, the forces have certainly improved. And I actually spoke only, towards the latter end of last year, I went to a dining in night, which is a formal event in Officers' Mess. I was invited there to speak about the importance of inclusion at a large formal event. And it was strange to be back at Cranwell, because I live in Lincolnshire, and RAF Cranwell is not probably 30 minutes from where I live, which is where I did my officer training. It's strange to be back there as a guest of honour, talking about some of the challenges I'd faced, certainly in my early career in the Air Force, but it was great to have those conversations. Moving on from that, 5, that's my partner, Sally. And the reason that Sally's there is because Sally keeps me very grounded. So, you know, having that, Sally's a therapist, and quite often when you're doing work like this, as I'm sure any of you that are involved in the D&I work, sometimes you get so fatigued by it because you don't see those changes. You're having the consistently the same conversation. And what you're seeing is a tick box approach. So people say, well, we've got the policy, tick. We have got you know, a certain number of people who fall into that category, tick, we're done. So you see a tick box approach rather than actually changing the narrative, and more importantly, changing the environment. And it becomes tiring, because you're constantly having that same conversation. And so it's important that you stay grounded. You know, Sally is obviously a major part of my life in actually ensuring that happens. And 6 is just on holiday there. 7 and 8, I put those on. 7 is the person in the middle of that photograph is my son. He's a surgeon, specialising in trauma surgery in London. And the reason I put that there is that you'll notice also on 8, he is also wearing he's actually the formal dress kit of an RAF officer. And he is also a squadron leader in the Air Force. He's a military surgeon, although he works in the NHS hospitals, because that's the way that military surgeons tend to be. If obviously they're not deployed, then they're working with the NHS as a trauma surgeon. And obviously incredibly proud. And it was quite interesting that when he made squadron leader, because of course being a medic, he actually made it slightly younger than I did, because the squadron leader is a kind of senior officer rank. He texted me and saying, "Squadron Leader Pearce, this is Squadron Leader Pearce." And it was actually quite funny, because he'd beaten me to it by a couple of months, and actually had to buy him a bottle of port for that. But obviously, again, you know, an important part in terms of grounding and in terms of that pride, because what we do in this space isn't about me. Right? It's really about those that come after me, so they don't face the same challenges. Number 9, that's mum. That's actually just about the last picture I had of with mum before she passed away. So my mum and dad have passed. My mum passed 2 years ago now. Well, coming to 3 years. 3 years ago. And I should point out, and I'm very missed, I missed the picture of my sister, because I had my sister as well. My sister was mum and dad's natural child. She was 12 years older than me. And she was wonderful, because it'd been very easy for her to reject this baby that's suddenly come into the house. She was fantastic. Unfortunately, my sister died very young as well, some 3 months after my father, around about 12 years ago. So, the family that nurtured and brought me up have all passed. And so it's, the importance of actually having their legacy with Philip, and actually with Philip's children, Gabriel and Benji, is part of that legacy. And I think that's important to remember, that people's stories and actions do live on. 11 and 12 there. So that was actually back at Keble. I was back in college just for a weekend with friends last year. And again, friends are important. And I see 12 as well on the golf course. Sally's a much bigger golfer than I am. She's on the left of the picture there. But we actually live 200 meters from one of the top golf courses in the UK, in Woodall Spa. And in fact, it's actually ranked one of the top 50 in the world, depending which golf magazine you read. But that was a nice summer's evening. And so that's, again, part of my life. To relax, because it's important to get away from it. We all need a break and play some golf. And the other pictures there are to do the work around D&I, the Executive Leadership Council, which has been mentioned, which is a membership organisation that's aim is to ensure we develop global Black leaders. Some 800 members, predominantly in the US. Some 3 years ago, they also branched into the UK. I'm fortunate enough to be the UK chair of the Executive Leadership Council. And we work, obviously, as a group, because these are senior Black leaders across a number of industries, to support the development of our future leaders, to provide and have those conversations. And you see in 14, there's one of the discussions with some of the ELC members. And you see Trevor Phillips there, who's also a member of the ELC. And the inside track events that we have, where we have open and frank discussions with senior politicians and with the media about the challenges of race. So hopefully that gives you some kind of background as to my drive for this, and as to why inclusion is so important, and as to why we need to change that narrative, and the ongoing work, but at times I say tiring and fatiguing, because you don't see that change that you want to. But it's, I would say at the moment, there is a positive momentum, and that's what I want to talk about next. I don't know if anybody has any points or questions or anything you wanted to raise before I move on.
So we've had a number of individuals who are asking predominantly about how you felt when it came to growing up within an area which was generally very white and British. And again, you know this because we've spoken, Andrew, but this story resonates such a huge amount with me, because I too was adopted by white British parents, albeit I know how incredibly rife racism really was in the 60s, from just reading up and seeing a lot of previous kind of media pieces from the times back then. But would be really curious to also hear how you managed to battle through those times, because I think there's a number of others who have written in who have had difficult experiences as youngsters. Some are young and starting their career journey and already feel quite different, and so how to have the courage to be able to step up and be brave ultimately.
And that's that's a really difficult question, because it obviously depends upon the individual. If I think about how I felt at the time, in some circumstances, very isolated. And I think if you take today, if people are feeling isolated and don't know what to say, find someone that you can speak to. That's the first thing. Whether it's in the company or place that you work, or whether it's by seeking a mentor, you can have those open conversations with. because being able to offload about the concerns is vitally important. To be able to discuss it with someone who will listen without judgment, who can empathize with it, is vitally important. Find those allies and find those advocates. And in fact, I think what's so important as to how we make this a more equal and just society across our communities and our business and our companies is to develop those allies and advocates who will do it and listen to us without judgment. Because it is difficult to find your voice if you're the only person. If you're the only person in the room, whether it's you're the only one in the room, whether it's you're the only black person in the room, if you're the only person in the room, it's very difficult to find your voice. So you need allies, you need advocates. And there will be times when you feel as though that those aren't out there. Find those networks that can support you and speak to those individuals, because you don't want to have to go through those challenges alone, because there will be challenging times. And it's important that you find someone you can speak to about it. I would hope the world has changed from the 60s, when it was a lot of overt racism, but that doesn't detract about how you can feel by the death of 1,000 cuts, as it were. You may not see as much overt racism, but those microaggressions can pile up. And being able to go and talk to somebody about that, if you don't have the voice yourself because you feel as though you're too junior, or that you feel as though there might be recriminations or someone will come back at you, then it's important to find an allied advocate. And if the worst case scenario, none of those work, then find somewhere that you can feel more comfortable.
Thanks so much, Andrew, for answering that. And I mean, the obvious question which we have had is around your, how you have felt, first of all, when it comes to, the George Floyd murder, amongst others, and those close to home in the UK, but also your observations over whether this is starting to diminish, and whether we really did get the movement that we expected and hoped for behind this to really spearhead and drive change. Yeah,
well, maybe if actually move on to the next slide, we can talk about that. That's because I think those are extremely important questions.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And I have got a number of other questions, but I think that they are likely to get covered in the presentation. So I'll interject and go on mute now.
No, it's fine. Let's talk about that. So I think this flows nicely from the question that was raised about Black Lives Matter, and there's a great quote here from Ibram Kendi. Being anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular self-examination. You remember the importance I talked about allies and advocates, and having that support network around you. And I've heard a number of comments about what Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. Why is this so important? I think it's useful just to have a reflection about why this is important and the impact that George Floyd and others have had. And I think the other point as well is this any different than previously? Because we've had this before. We've been at these points of time before where we've had strong discussions. 4, 5, 6 years ago, we started this conversation, for example, about, we need more BAME representation. Now, I will say, and some people think this is, quite an odd thing to say, I think BAME is a quite useless term, because it allows companies to hide behind a multitude of reality. It is not a helpful term, because what tends to happen, and this is what was happening over 4 or 5 years, is, okay, and again, because of that tick box approach, okay, we've done our recruitment, we've looked at how we're represented across the company, and we're 25, 30% BAME. We're done, we're finished. Now, the companies who really want to make a difference said, hold on a second, that doesn't seem quite right, because particularly if we look at Black representation, if you actually dissect that representation, then you'll see it doesn't tell the full story. So I think BAME was used almost as a word for within HR because it was easy to say, rather than talking about what look if you actually dissect that across the various ethnicities and get a clear view about how your representation stands. So, you know, and often it's the language that's difficult. People don't like talking about the word black. They don't like to use the word black because there's the concern about offense, and I understand that. But it's important that we actually start talking about the language of race so we can have these open conversations and move away from that tick box approach. Now, what I think is different this time is that we have a generation, especially Generation Z, who are committed to a more equitable world, who actually want to have a more diverse society, both in the communities and within business. We also are in the age of social media. Remember that great quote, I think it was Malcolm X, that not Malcolm X, I can't remember who it was now, perhaps somebody can remind me, the revolution has not been televised. This time it has been televised. Okay? We witnessed those terrible scenes with George Floyd. So you've got the social media aspect, and you've got a large number of that generation who are actively involved in social media, who made this into a movement that spread virally very quickly, who will quite happily, quickly group up and protest against it. And it's something that can't be ignored. And when you've got that next working generation who are saying, hey, I don't want to be in a company that's not saying anything about this, and that generation was saying that, then companies had to respond. Not only because it was the right thing to do, but because that cohort of the future workers were not going to tolerate it. In addition to that, you also have the view that says, and very clearly and very accurately, that in a world of disruption and innovation, you need diverse teams. If you have a group of 10, 15 people who all look the same, who all have had the same kind of background, then how do you get new ideas? You don't. So, innovation, diversity has a major impact on that. And again, companies realize that. And there is the revenue aspect. If you actually totally distance a population by not standing up and saying, actually, this is wrong, that's a huge amount of revenue you left on the table. If I take the business aspect, a huge amount of revenue. And again, in a world where you have social media and viral, a company can quickly go off the rails. So I think there is momentum there. That momentum continues. A number of companies have made very clear commitments. What I'm interested in is how those actions will be followed up. Will I still be having this conversation? Will we still be having this conversation in a year's time? Or will we have seen those actions? It's interesting to see the report about the commitments from a number of companies, Lloyd's, Barclays, for example, who've said they will be hiring and ensuring there is more Black senior staff. Now, they've made those commitments. Now, if they don't, then what happens to the working population that are coming in? All that strong talent that are saying, okay, this is great, I'm going to join that company, and then don't see that progress. They'll move. You'll lose them. And you're not representing, therefore, your communities, and there's bound to be a backlash. So not only is it the right thing to do, primarily, it's necessary for business to actually do that. So there has to be a change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely concur, Andrew. And it's
sorry, Leah.
So I was just saying, I absolutely concur with everything that you said there. I'm just going to interject. We have a number of people who've been talking about Black buying power and Black marketing power, and the fact that there is also a disparity basically between racial profiling by retailers and other organizations when it comes to the actual power of Black and ethnic communities they have in terms of disposable income and expenditure, which they will spend seeing organizations reflected in their own societies. And I can tell, listening to you, as you alluded to in the earlier slides, is diversity and inclusion, it can be quite exhausting, because I've heard a lot of your interviews and it is saying the same things time and time again. black buying power, it makes commercial business sense, and if we're not reflected and represented, there is going to be a drop off in terms of engagement, and these individuals are absolutely valuable and imperative to business success. And I think just one quick question that I will ask from one of our participants, which is around them seeing a drop off at mid management for black staff in specific. They have looked at certain metrics, and they have looked at some of the figures and conducted certain interviews as well, but they seem to keep getting this drop off at this particular point within the career trajectories of these black employees, and that's male and female as well, by the way. And I wondered whether you had any thoughts at all around how there could be actions to look at solving some of these issues. And again, I know it's not a one silver bullet scenario, but any advice?
Yeah, and this is, you know, a complex area, and probably one that's worth doing another discussion about, purely about how you retrain, progress, and develop. I think you'll find that the majority of companies have that drop off at that mid-manager level among black employees, particularly among black males. There is a drop off. You know, a number of companies have done good stuff in terms of the recruitment level, you know, against demographics. So, for example, you take the demographics, we'll use London. If you take the demographics of London, then you'd have approximately, according to the last census, although it's 10 years out of date now, approximately 13-14% would identify as being black or from African Caribbean background. And if you actually look at the number of companies who are recruiting at the junior levels, those percentage actually do match up quite well to demographics. But as you start to move up at manager, you see a big drop off. And a major factor behind that is that it's this case of, I don't see anybody senior, and it's not the only factor I should point out, but a major factor is, I don't see anybody senior who looks like me. Why am I staying at a company where when I look up, I see only white faces? I do not see people that represent me. And it's not so much a glass ceiling, it's a concrete ceiling is the phrase I like to use, because you can't see anybody that looks like you. And therefore that lack of visible role models does not help to retain. The other issue as well, and I say it's a complex thing, we can have a whole discussion about the kind of actions you can take. It's not just a case of then parachuting senior leaders in. You know, that can help it to have, you know, to actually go out and find senior black leaders. There is not a huge number. As chair of the ULC, I can state that. But if you know, you can go out and find them and attract them to your company to help drive this. But what you ultimately need to do is to build your own pipeline. Because if you get the numbers in at the kind of junior levels, why are you not retaining people? Are they not getting the right roles? Are they not having the right sponsors? Are they not getting the right, is there a problem with performance? Are they not getting the right feedback? Is there a cultural issue? Or, let's be honest, is there systemic racism? Right? And you have to be honest with yourself. And it's important that across all levels, you examine that and take targeted actions as necessary. Is there a development program we should be doing? How can we increase the network? How can we give people a voice? How do you develop advocates to understand the challenges that some of our people face and as to why they feel as though they're not appreciated or welcome here? You know, so there's a number of things that have to be considered. But, you know, if I'm there and I'm looking up and saying, I don't see anybody looks like me, I'm probably going to go somewhere else. That's certainly a major factor in it. But there's a number of actions you can start to take, but also use the word actions, not just words. You can't just play lip service to this. You're going to lose good talent. You can't play lip service. You've got to take actions. You're going to be brave enough to take actions. And the companies that have been brave enough to stand up and say, you know what, we've got this wrong. We thought we did enough. We haven't. We have so much more to do. This is what we're going to do. For example, if you take, I'll use Bank of America. I was actually on a call last night, a webinar last night, kind of professionals in the city, and they had Rothschilds, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America. And Bank of America are investing something like $1 billion to actually turn, if you like, the game around in terms of developing black leaders. JP Morgan have actually, Tia, who I know, she's got a great job title. She is responsible within EMEA. The title is Development of Black Leaders. What a great title, right? You know, they're taking targeted actions to actually say, we're wrong. How do we develop our people? How do we retain our people? How do we progress? How do we have frank discussions, times when we're going to feel uncomfortable as we start to become comfortable, and how do we create allies and advocates who understand the challenges? Because another part of the problem, and I'll come to it shortly, I suppose, but I'll mention it now, is not understanding the challenges that individuals may face, because you're seeing the world. If you're white, often it's easy to assume that the world for them is the same as it is for you, and it isn't. And it's an important part of that journey, as part of that realization, to help support and develop. I'm sorry, that was a long answer, but I hope I covered some of the points. But I think it's such a complex thing. You could have a full 2 hours talking about actual actions you can take. But the bottom is, you have to take actions. You have to be honest, got to be brave, and start having conversations with people in the company and ask, well, okay, what can we do better?
Well, the length of the answer is just the tip of the iceberg, because as you rightly say, Andrew, this is it's a complex, multifaceted issue, and there's multiple different ways that we can address this. Plus the fact that, as you say, all different organisations are different. One quick last question from someone else. They wondered, so first of all, great work, thank you, well done. Accenture are brilliant. We've had a number of our members who have stolen with pride, in inverted commas, some of the great pieces that Accenture have done when it comes to D&I. And I think it's pretty obvious across the board that Accenture are a leader in the field when it comes to holistic diversity and inclusion. But the questions are around some of the more successful organizations, specifically within the race facet of D&I, that you have observed. You mentioned Bank of America there, which is why I asked this question, because I know that you've got oversight of many different organizations. And I know you can't necessarily mention names, but which are some of the great examples from organizations you've seen do particularly well, was one of the questions. And I think it follows on quite nicely from the Bank of America example, which is, agreed, a very good job title indeed, because it says what it is, doesn't it? And it's,
that's JP Morgan. With that
apologies, Bank of America, JP Morgan.
No. Bank of America. I've mentioned Lloyd's as well, are doing some great work in this area. It's interesting. It's a lot of the financial institutions are doing an awful lot of work in this area.
Absolutely. Are you seeing any trends in that? Sorry, another question. That's actually a question for myself, but I've noticed the same. A lot of insight and market trends that I'm seeing is a huge amount of investment coming from these FS and fintechs, to be fair, as well.
Yeah. That's it's interesting, isn't it? Because actually, you look at the representation at the senior levels within these organizations, it's poor. But what they are doing, what they're effectively doing, it goes back to the comment I raised earlier on, they're building that internal pipeline. They are saying this is poor. They also recognize there's an awful lot of customers out there that would be much more attractive if they actually see an organization that reflects their community around them. There's also, the whole continent of Africa, which is going to start growing and having teeth as we see development and a lot of innovation coming out of Africa. You'll want to actually have teams that reflect more your client base as well. So, but what they have done is they've recognized that there is a concern, they've taken positive action, and they're looking to develop, recruit, and then develop and retain people who will be the future leaders. We will see more Black CEOs and Black C members going forward, but it's not going to be something that happens overnight. These actions are not something you take tomorrow and expect a result next week. These actions that you take, and you nurture and keep on top of them. You don't let them fall behind the wayside, and that is how you build that pipeline. But the FS has taken really on that. And I mentioned, as I say, Bank of America. I mentioned JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley again. They're big sponsors of a number of initiatives to help drive this. Lloyd's, HSBC. I know that Deloitte and EY are doing much more active work in this area as well. And they've all made public commitments as to what they will do to start changing the appearance. Now, what they're doing internally, I can't comment on, but they've made clear commitments about where they want to be and where they're going and what they will not stand for. Mm-hmm. My interest is more about what this means to the community and to the future leaders. Will they see the fruits of this? I would like to think so, but the momentum, you cannot turn away from it, because it is not just a moment. People talk about it being a moment. Of course, there was a moment, that moment of realization that something is wrong. And what brought us to this point, you'll see on there, it's just some of the names. But it's an ongoing dialogue now. You can't just say, right, we've made our commitment, we're done. It's now ongoing dialogue. It's ongoing action, because there is a generation looking at you now saying, we've seen this, we've reacted to it, we've complained about it, we've campaigned about it. And if you are not doing what you say you're going to do, you've got a whole generation there who are going to notice it, comment about it, and not join you. You're not going to be future leaders, there's nobody joining. So, you have to look at the reality of this. And along with that, you've got systemic racism. Police brutality, obviously the events in the US, but we also see it in the UK. Let's not forget, we do see it in the UK. Educational disadvantage. And I think this is another important point. As part of the work, it's not only the work that you do within your organizations. What can your organizations do in the community? You may have heard me say, I'm often disappointed when I see Black leaders who don't give back. Don't pull up the ladder. Don't think, well, I've made it, that's it, I'm done. No, you've gone through challenges generally to get there. What are you going to do to help other people? Madeleine Albright famously said many years ago, the lowest circle of hell is reserved for women that don't help other women up. The same applies now. You need to actually help, mentor, and support. And that's not only in business, but it's also working community, working whether it's in local schools, because quite often within these disadvantaged areas, you having input on that and supporting it can mean the difference between someone having that successful path in life as opposed to moving to crime. That's the reality of it. Judicial discrimination. I don't know if anybody has or has not seen 13 on Netflix. If you haven't, then I would really advise you to watch it. It's about the prison system in the US and the discrimination that's shown because of skin color. The other one I would certainly recommend would be this, When They See Us, which is about the Central Park 5. And Leila, if you've not seen those, then put those on your list to watch over the weekend. They're not happy tales.
I've not seen When They See Us. I've not seen When They See Us. I hear it very highly recommended.
Yeah, Sally, who, as I say, is a very calm therapist, nearly through something at television, she was so angry because this is real, this is based on real life. And 13 is documentary. I'd certainly recommend them as part of that education. COVID-19, as we know, has disproportionately affected that Black community and corporate representation. So, a number of things are brought to this point. It's what we do now is, what side of history are you going to stand on? That's the ask. And, maybe if I move to the next one, I often get this, and I think it's a useful one because I think it's important because people often complain and say, well, all lives matter. Of course they do. Of course all lives matter. But actually, all lives don't matter until Black lives matter, right? And we know all lives matter. But at the moment, when people are dying because or not getting the opportunities or struggling because of lack, because there is no privilege in being black, then that's what black lives are in danger. It's important that we recognize that fact. And there is, a privilege. And the point is, if you're white, there's a privilege to it. And I'm not saying that in any kind of nasty way. One thing I meant to put the slide in was for the privilege game. I'll perhaps save that for another time, Layla. But it's a very simple game. Asks you a number of questions. You hold up your fingers, and every time it's you have had that, then you put a finger down. And predominantly, if you're black, you'll put at least 5 or 6 fingers down, because it might be things being stopped by the police, racial insults, followed by a store detective, people pulling their bags close to you just when you walk past. Those are the type of things that happen based upon people's skin color. So, remember that when we talk about Black Lives Matter, it is not that nobody else's lives matter. All lives, of course, matter. But all lives only matter if you remember the fact that it's the house on fire at the moment is if you're black. And so it's a conversation I've seemed to have had too often over the last few weeks about this. And I'm sure people with the best intent, but they've not understood the issues that have driven people to this point of time. I can send you this slide, Layla, you want it? That's fine.
Thank you. I was just going to post this later because it's an exceptional one, and I was laughing because it's funny, to read the cartoon, but there's a very, very serious undertone there, which is so very true. And to you and I and to many others, it's so obvious. Well, obviously we know that all lives matter, but it is amazing how much backlash there is. And you mentioned there the privilege test. We've done with a number of groups of our C-suite from different organizations, the privilege walk, where you take there's various different iterations of it. And I put
step forward.
Yes, absolutely. And then, it's often quite an emotional piece when those who are at the front of the room look back and they realize actually how much further they are than other individuals. And there's a great video. It's quite an old video, but I posted it on LinkedIn some while ago. And it was all about privilege. In essence, absolutely, the finger piece that you are doing with the privilege test. And there was so many positive comments and individuals saying that really demonstrates in a great and emotive way, what privilege is about. But surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, we should say, there was a whole host of other individuals saying all lives matter, making racist comments. And on professional networks like LinkedIn, I was absolutely horrified, and it was everything that the team and I could do not to go back in situations like that. And actually a couple of the team are WhatsApping me now saying, how do you deal with things like that? Now, in our circumstance, we either chose to reply in a dignified way, or we would ignore comments like that because you obviously disregard them. But how would you, from a professional context, obviously working for a large firm like Accenture, or even to be recommending to your clients what they do in instances like that? Because if that was personal and it was, we all took it very personally, and I think that's the difficulty, because you start getting very emotional when things like this are involved, especially to do with race and ethnicity, and it's easy to take things as personal slights. But if they are directed towards certain individuals, or even youngsters who aren't as seasoned in terms of leadership like yourself, who would know well enough to be saying, right, okay, it doesn't matter, but for some, that could really make or break them, that kind of abuse online, especially in the COVID environment, when you're not exactly at the water fountain chatting with colleagues that you know, like, and trust.
Social media is a horrible place at times, right? It is a horrible place. And, people say, well, we're entitled to our opinion. No, you're entitled to an informed opinion. You're not entitled to ignorance, is my view. I take, you may say, quite a draconian view to this, because if I see that kind of response from somebody, as far as I'm concerned, if they happen to be whether it's on Facebook, I tend to use Facebook just for kind of personal friend stuff, or on LinkedIn or Twitter, if I see that kind of response, and somebody might say it in the best interest, and then somebody might come back and say, well, actually, what about this? And people quite often, as with this cartoon, say, oh, okay, I get it now, I understand it. But some people will stamp their feet and say, no, 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 no. You know, they're just all terrorists, all campaigning. It's a one of the classic ones. It's a Marxist kind of protest. I treat it very simply. I just defriend them. I just unlink them. I see no reason. There's enough toxicity in the world. Why would I expose myself to it? You know, on that social media platform, you know, that it's very simple. You know, I don't want toxic people in my life, either professionally or personally. I just won't have it. If it happens in a kind of a business context, then I'll obviously call it out. You know, I'm old enough and with enough kind of scars to call it out. I will call people out. I may not do it at the meeting because I may not want to embarrass them, and they may have done it unintentionally, but I'll certainly speak to them. But that's an advantage I have, because I, at that point where I can not do it because of any kind of elevation, as it were, but because I'm of that age now, I will do it. I will not longer put up with it. If you know, someone who is more junior could feel very difficult in that kind of situation, which is why I appeal, don't let it sit there on its own. I was on a call a couple of weeks back. It was a black table talk, and people were talking about some of their experiences. And there was a young girl on there talked about the fact she'd gone out with her business team, you know, from work, to an event at a comedy store. And this was in the US. And the comedian was telling very racist jokes. And she was with her team from work, who were all laughing at them. All laughing at them. And she said the next day, I had to go into the office with those people, knowing that they were laughing at jokes that I was obviously upset about. And I didn't say anything about it, because I didn't want to feel as though I was a troublemaker. You know, that is terrible. Absolutely terrible. And which is why it's important that if people feel in any way that, or say in any way, because in the day it's how people feel. And this, you know, phrase often here as well, it's just banter. Banter it's still very hurtful to somebody. It's how you make people feel. And if people are feeling, you know, bad, I use the word bad, I could use a much stronger word, but if people are feeling bad, don't feel on your own. Find someone you can talk to, you know. Phone up Layla. Ping me if you want to talk to at work. Find a friend. Speak to somebody about it, but don't put up with it on your own, because it will get you. You will have that death thousand cuts, which is why, you know, enterprise resource groups or networks, as they're called, are so important, because it's a place, a safe place where people can go and share. So if there are no networks, it's difficult. Find a network externally. Find a network you can join, but find people who can support you. Or as I said to you, find those allies to talk to. You know, find your HR or I&D department, talk to them, but find those allies, because you shouldn't have to feel unwelcome, unbelonging, and not included for any reason. And it's upsetting when I hear these stories time and time again. And quite often it's because people feel that if they complain, they'll ultimately suffer, because they don't see people that like them who are doing those complaints. They don't have those outgoing natural allies and advocates who are visibly standing up there, or not enough of it to feel as though they can go to them. And that's part of the problem. We can change all of that by having vocal, open allies. You know, look at the Me Too movement. Look how that developed, you know, and quite rightly dealing with that sexist, quite often again disguised as banter, and getting rid of that kind of behaviour. So it's totally unacceptable, and we have to do the same with race. And we are not there. We are not there. And there is much more that all of us can do to actually drive that.
Hear, 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 hear. One quick question here, Andrew, because I'm very conscious of time, and I don't think we're going to have time for actually everyone's questions. I know there's a couple in the chat, which I really, really hope have been answered by Andrew. I'm sure that they have, but if you have any further questions, obviously let us know. I want you, Andrew, to be able to get to the end of your presentation, but I'm very quickly going to ask this one question because I think it's one that could be in the minds of many, especially those who will be catching up on demand. So this individual, who's actually anonymous, says, we're worried that we aren't good enough as a business on race and ethnicity. We're doing well in gender and LGBTQ+, but fearful of speaking out about race when we don't have the representation that we should do, and we don't want to be accused of tokenism.
Yeah, and that's, again, a very good question. But I think what's good about that question is there's a realization you want to do more. Right? So you want to do more, and tokenism isn't the right way to do it. I agree. Tokenism is wrong for so many reasons, because it doesn't benefit the individual, it doesn't benefit the company. I think coming to the point of saying we have not done enough, what do we do next, is how you start that journey. And you have to be brave enough as a company to say, actually, we have not done enough, but these are the concrete actions we will take. And it might well be you're going to invest in training for executives and managing the company about what it means, for example, to be anti-racist. It might well be you're going to encourage people to come and have a talk with you and have uncomfortable discussions, so you can become comfortable about talking about race, and to give you advice about how you then start to attract, develop and retain. But the first thing is to actually say, actually, we've not got this right. That's actually quite a strong comment. And you don't want to do tokenism. You don't want to go and get people for the sake of getting them, because they're not a fix of the company. Then actually it's not very helpful for the community or individual. But what you can do is say, no, we're not representative. What do we do? What do we need to change about ourselves? What do we need to learn about? What are the conversations we need to be able to have? What are the actions we can take? Who are the companies that can support and help us and have these conversations with? Why is this important? And how do we put a commitment from that leadership level across all levels as to what will not be tolerated? But the first step is to say, yeah, we're not there. But then you say, okay, how can we get help? And I think that's basically what you've said. Does that help?
Perfect. Very well said, Andrew. And I know we could do another whole session about all of this. And so trying to keep things brief, because I know we've only got 4 minutes and I want you to be able to get to the end of your presentation.
Yeah, okay, quickly. I wanted to, I can go on a few minutes longer, it's okay. But I think, you know, a very powerful quote, you know, from back in the 60s, 70s, Angela Davis, one of the great civil rights leaders in the States. And it's a quote now that you see more and more often, which is great. You know, it's not enough to be non-racist, you must be anti-racist. And I'll, you know, my last slide, I'll just quickly mention what I mean by anti-racism. I think, and this is an important point for everybody who wants to be an ally and advocate, you have to understand there's a difference between non-racist and being anti-racist. I think a lot of people, I'd say everybody who joins this call, who looks at this webinar, I would like to say, would say, but I'm not racist. I'm a non-racist. And you'll see, you know, people in rooms or in social events saying, well, I'm not racist, which is great, because that's a good position to start from, rather than saying I am racist. But the big difference, I'll give you a quite simple example, is let's say you're at, I don't know, a social event, and someone tells a racist joke. Now, the non-racist is probably not going to laugh, or may, you know, smirk and try and ignore it, and then, you know, go and talk to someone they know and say, I can't believe he said that, I wouldn't say that. You know, so they'll have that little conversation between themselves and say, you know, I wouldn't ever say anything like that. The anti-racist at the time of the event would say that's unacceptable. The anti-racist in a meeting where someone does something that's obviously quite microaggressive, whether it's, for example, talking over somebody who may be black, or making a joke again, or saying something that's unacceptable, will say that's unacceptable. You know, they will stand up and stand in the shoes of someone who's black and say, this isn't right. They'll educate themselves on what it means to be black and the challenges faced. They will voice very clearly. So if you like, an anti-racist is an activist, you know, an activist who will constantly correct. And it's not an easy journey because there's an awful lot of racism out there. And when you realize that, when you actually start doing that kind of self-education piece, because it does involve self-education, you know, I'm more than happy to talk about this all day, but ultimately people need to educate themselves about what it means and what the experience is. But to then move on to be that activist, that's what anti-racism is just being very clear about what is not acceptable and being that voice and changing that narrative and understanding that things are not equal. I mean, a common phrase that people use is, well, I'm colorblind. And that's said with all the best intent in the world, don't get me wrong, I'm colorblind. But the problem with that statement is you're seeing the world, as I mentioned earlier on, you think the world is the same for everybody as it is for you. It isn't. You have to acknowledge there is a different experience. And therefore, when you acknowledge that, you see the difference in treatment. And when you see that difference in treatment, that is what you say is not right. And I am going to help to drive and change that. So I can actually, based again on Dr. Andrew Ibram's model about becoming anti-racist, and maybe I can say this, Layla, I'll send a link to it, you can put something on there. But it's interesting because I suspect, you know, if you look at this, people find themselves in different areas on this. Quite often people start in that fear zone. I deny racism as a problem, or I don't like to talk about race. I'm comfortable not talking about it. I challenge you, you know, if you're in business, look at your phone, and when there's a business problem, a business issue, or you want to talk about something, who are the first 4 people you phone? Are they people that look like you? Are they people that have the same background to you? Or, you know, look at the first 8 people you phone. You know, in other words, how diverse is your own personal network? Be honest with yourself. What are you doing to actually diverse, you know, make your network more diverse? Or are you much more comfortable within that zone? But that's that kind of that fear zone that you think, you know, everything is like, you know, I'm non-racist, so everything must be fine. And that goes back to the point. Being anti-racist, you go on that journey. You first of all recognize, you know, you can see there in that learning zone, you recognize that it's a problem. You start understanding what it means to the privilege. Understanding what your biases are. That's important. We all have biases, but you need to understand what they are and start to deal with them and have conversations about how to deal with them. Then, you know, how do you go further? Understanding what it means to you. How do you advocate? You know, how do you become the advocate? Understand your discomfort, because there'll always be conversations that you feel discomfortable about. Speak out when you see racism. Talk to your peers about how racism is not helping your company or your profession or your community. You know, you will make mistakes. A learning journey, because this is not a tick box again. This is not a tick, this is not a process, it's not transactional. This is about understanding how people feel, getting in their shoes, understanding that real empathy, educating yourself. You will make mistakes. And people often worry about the mistakes they'll make in their language. That's fine. That's fine to make mistakes. As you go through that, you'll make mistakes. But, you know, don't worry. That's part of that journey. But you need, and you may look at this and think, well, I actually see myself sitting in all those zones. And that's, again, fine. But look at what you can do to move further out and become anti-racist. And, you know, a number of things on here that help you on that journey. Educate, you know, look to understand. I mentioned a couple of Netflix series I'd certainly watch, which 13 and When They See Us. I'd also recommend reading and no longer talking to white people about race, or the book How to Be an Anti-Racist. But read some of those books, watch those films, understand the experience, start to understand how people feel and what they've been through. Educate yourself. Look at, who you follow socially. Look at what follow on podcasts. Take time, speak to black colleagues. And I'm not saying, this is often people say, well, what, should I just go up to somebody and say, look, you're black, tell me about what it's like to be black? No, establish a relationship. Diversify, establish your relationship, and then you can have those conversations. The fact the person's black, fine, but go and talk to Fred. But get to know, establish relationships, and then as that relationship develops, have those conversations and be honest and say, I want to understand. I'd like to know the challenges. Educate others. Talk to friends and family. Take your children through the anti-racist circles there and have those discussions. That's a great way to have conversations with family, to talk about it. Advocate. As you educate, understand the problems, stand in the gap for your black colleagues. Acknowledge the racial problems and discuss it. Whether it's in your company, in your teams, discuss it, have conversations, take some time, have a brown bag lunch, talk about it. Again, on social media, if you want to be positive in social media on this, look at issues, look at articles, repost them, put your own content there. This is a great article, it really helped me. It's great to see this, or this is terrible, what more could we do to actually help this and happen? But look at them. If you're leadership, use your position. Help to amplify that black voice. Become an advocate, understand the challenges, and then talk about it. Go to events, listen, talk, learn, speak, be public. Use your talents and skills. And in the investment side, look at charities, look at black businesses, and amplify black talent, and diversify your talent pools. Look at the people at your phone. Are there other people that you could phone and you haven't? Look at who's on that list. So, there's some positive things you can do. And I appreciate it's challenging. I appreciate it's a journey. You will make mistakes. But these are things you need to go through. If you really want to get to understand, be credible, and speak out and help to amplify that voice, you're going to go through some discomfort getting there. And it's not something we can do in an hour. It's something we can do, over a few discussions. But there is work that, you would need to do personally to get to that point. And I'm sorry I rattled through that, but I think we're just out of time there. Leila, I don't know if there's any burning questions.
We are indeed, and I think that was an absolutely on point, as expected, summary there. This is a multifaceted and complex issue, as you have said, and I think these are some really great key points and actionable insights that people can take away. Actually, every single one of us can do something. Every one of us, we can be an ally. We don't have to be black and have had the black lived experience in order to advocate for black lives, race and ethnicity and what matters. So I think this has been a perfect way to actually end today. Andrew, I won't go through summarising everything, so I think you did it very, very well there, but a couple of real key pieces that I think stood out to me are taking action and hosting conversations. Keep talking about things. None of us are perfect. Unless we are black ourselves, we have not had that black experience, so we must seek to educate ourselves and our wider organisations about this, because future generations, present generations will not stand for it. And so make sure you are doing this, if not for yourself, but for the wider organisation, because it makes absolute business sense as well. I think Andrew's demonstrated some brilliant case studies here, and really just tipping on the iceberg, because there's so much more that we can learn. We're going to put all of the books, the series mentioned for Netflix, all of the slides are going to be going into the community. If you've got any further questions, make sure you do ask them. We will make sure that we summarize all the key learning points from the session with Andrew today. So if you've missed anything, you had to drop off early, or you're watching this on demand, don't worry at all. You can not only download the slides, which Andrew is very kindly going to share, but you can also look at the summary notes in addition. And we will be sharing some of those slides that you you shared there, Andrew, because I think some of them, in particular the last one, was absolutely excellent. It really just shows through that journey. And like you say, remember, we're all at different phases of the journey. None of us are perfect. No organisation is perfect. But if not now, then when? We've got to start someone. We've got to keep flying the flag for this movement and for Black lives and for all others as well. So thank you very, very much again, Andrew. You can visit us at www.dialglobal.org, and you can find all the information on our community hosted by Mighty Networks on the app and online. Thank you again, Andrew.